There are people who build their entire lives around loss, not because they chose to, but because loss arrived first, uninvited, immovable, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, they found a way to make it mean something. Nancy Guthrie is one of those people. For years, she stood before grieving parents, broken families, and hearts that had stopped knowing how to beat the same way they used to. And she told them the one thing most people never had the courage to say out loud, that there could still be light. That the darkest thing they had ever lived through was not the final word on their lives. People trusted her with that, completely, without reservation. She wrote books that found their way onto nightstands in hospitals, in grief counseling offices, in the bedrooms of people who had stopped sleeping well. She led retreats where strangers wept openly for the first time in years, not because they were told to, but because something in the room finally made it feel safe. She built a voice, a platform, a ministry, all of it grown from her own unimaginable pain. The kind of pain that most people never fully survive emotionally, let alone transform into something that helps other people remember how to breathe. And then something shifted, quietly at first. The way these things always move before they become impossible to ignore. A question here, a silence there, a scheduled appearance that didn't happen. A presence that slowly began to feel smaller, more distant, harder to locate. The people who had followed her for years started to feel it not all at once, but in that slow, creeping way that arrives before understanding does. People noticed. They always do eventually. And now the community that once gathered around her voice is sitting with a question nobody expected to be asking: is this the end? Not just of a season or a chapter, but of everything she built. Everything those years of grief and work and trust were supposed to mean. What happened? And why does it feel like the answer keeps finding ways to stay just out of reach? To understand where Nancy Guthrie is now, you have to go back to where she started, because her story does not begin with recognition or a career path or a plan. It begins with a hospital room. With a diagnosis that no parent should ever have to sit still inside. With a daughter named Hope, who came into the world and then left it after just 6 months, and took something with her that can never quite be replaced. Hope had Zellweger syndrome. A rare, fatal metabolic disorder that has no treatment and no cure. When parents receive that diagnosis, they are essentially handed a countdown, nothing more. Nancy and her husband David lived inside that countdown together. They held their daughter. They stayed present through all of it. And when Hope died, something in Nancy broke open, the kind of breaking that could have ended her entirely, the kind that does end some people, but didn't. Instead, something unexpected grew in that space. Nancy began to write. Not as a private exercise, not as a way of processing grief in silence, but as a way of speaking it out loud in words that other people could actually hold on to. Her first book carried that weight honestly. It wasn't polished in the way that calculated things are polished. It wasn't designed. It was simply true. And truth, especially when it arrives wrapped in sorrow, reaches people in ways that nothing else can. Then it happened again. Another child, a son named Gabriel. Also diagnosed with Zellweger syndrome. Also given months instead of years. Some families are asked to carry grief that would collapse most people after a single experience. The Guthries were asked to carry it twice, to learn it twice, to survive it twice. Gabriel died too, and still Nancy did not go quiet. She went deeper, she kept writing, she launched a podcast. She built retreats, not the sanitized, everything unfolds for a reason version of grief support, but the real kind. The kind that sits with people at 3 in the morning when the silence is loudest. The kind that doesn't try to rush anyone toward resolution they haven't earned yet. Her name became known in specific, serious circles, Christian communities, grief support networks, biblical counseling spaces. She was never a mainstream figure, never chasing visibility in the way that the internet rewards. She was something quieter than that, arguably more powerful. She was the person people found when the worst thing had already happened, and they needed to know they could still keep moving. That reputation didn't arrive quickly. It was built slowly, carefully, on the foundation of having actually survived what she was talking about, which is exactly why what began to surface later feels so difficult to hold. So heavy with things that haven't been fully said. For a long time, everything visible about Nancy Guthrie's public life seemed to move steadily in one direction. Books continued to come, conferences. A podcast that grew not through viral moments, but through word of mouth, one grieving person telling another that they had found something worth hearing. Her ministry, called Hoping for Something Better, was anchored in Scripture and shaped by experience that gave her words a kind of weight that cannot be manufactured or borrowed. She was not trying to build a brand. That always seemed clear. There was no obvious strategy behind the presence she maintained, no calculated aesthetic, no engagement-chasing content. What she had instead was something rarer: credibility. The kind that only comes from having actually been through what you're talking about and from not pretending it was easier than it was. People in the grief space trusted her name. Pastors recommended her books to congregations that were hurting. Counselors passed her resources to clients who had run out of language for what they were feeling. Ordinary people, parents who had lost children, spouses sitting in empty rooms, children who had lost parents too soon, found her voice and felt, often for the first time, that someone actually understood the specific texture of what they were carrying. She and her husband David operated in the same spaces, the same communities. Together they represented something that felt stable, rooted. Not performing goodness but genuinely oriented toward service. Her podcast did not chase controversy. It built an audience the slow, honest way, episode by episode, guest by guest, each conversation grounded in real experience rather than theory. The people who listened didn't come for entertainment. They came because they needed something, and they had found that this was a place where that something was offered carefully. In the world she inhabited, trust wasn't just important. It was everything. The people who came to her retreats, who read her books at the hardest moments of their lives, who passed her name to someone they loved who was falling apart, they came with something fragile in their hands. And she held it. For years she held it. That world felt solid, unlikely to fracture, the kind of thing that looks permanent from the inside. But permanence, as most people who have lived through loss already know, is often a feeling more than a fact. It is almost never one moment. There is rarely a single event that changes the shape of someone's public life in a way that everyone around them can point to and say, there, that was it. More often it is smaller than that. A series of quiet shifts that accumulate before they become visible. A post that doesn't appear. An event that gets quietly removed from a calendar. A response that takes longer than it ever used to. A tone that adjusts, almost imperceptibly, until enough of those adjustments stack up that the people paying close attention begin to feel something without yet being able to name it. Those who had followed Nancy Guthrie for years began to feel exactly that. Not loudly. Not in a way that immediately demanded explanation. Just in the particular way that a community starts to notice when someone who has always been present begins slowly to become less so. Questions surfaced online, in comment sections, in the quieter corners of forums where her audience gathered, in private messages between people who were all asking the same thing without knowing anyone else was asking it too. Where has she been? Has something happened? Is she all right? For a while there were no anchors for those questions, just a feeling, a collective unease floating without a clear source. Then fragments of context began to arrive, because in Christian ministry spaces when something difficult unfolds, it rarely surfaces all at once. There are layers. Internal conversations that happen well before anything reaches the people watching from outside. Processes, sometimes formal, sometimes not, that govern what gets addressed, and how much of that addressing ever becomes visible to the broader community. According to reports that began circulating within those circles, questions had been raised in connection with matters related to Nancy's professional and ministry life. The specifics, as tends to be the case in these situations, were not consistently clear across different accounts. Different sources emphasized different details. No comprehensive official statement had been issued that brought everything into focus. No official conclusion had been reached. What was clear was that something had genuinely changed. And whatever that something was, it carried weight. Communities built around trust break differently than other communities do. When disruption arrives in a space where people came specifically because they were already vulnerable, already grieving, already fragile, the fracture doesn't look like ordinary disappointment. It looks more like grief layered on top of grief, and that is a particular kind of weight. When the questions surrounding Nancy Guthrie began to grow louder and more specific, the people in her audience did not respond as a single unified voice. Some moved immediately toward defense, arguing that context was missing, that incomplete reports were being treated as settled conclusions. That someone who had given so much to so many deserved something more careful than rushed judgment. Others felt something that didn't quite fit the word anger. It was closer to a quiet, aching sorrow, a sense of loss piled onto losses they were already living with, and some said nothing. Which in spaces like this one can say more than words sometimes do. The institutions and networks connected to her ministry faced the particular tension that religious organizations often cannot entirely avoid in these moments. How to hold accountability and care at the same time. How to address something real without creating more harm in the addressing. How to protect everyone involved, including the people who had brought concerns forward, while also remaining honest with a broader community that was already beginning to feel the ground shift beneath it. No resolution came quickly. These things rarely do when the person at the center carries a public role woven through with trust. Because the stakes extend well beyond the individuals directly involved. Every person who had attended a retreat read a book during the worst week of their life, or quietly recommended her name to someone who was falling apart. Each of those people was now sitting with something uncomfortable. A question about what had been true, a question about what the healing they had found actually meant now. That is not a simple thing to carry, and it doesn't have a clean name. There is a particular complexity at the center of Nancy Guthrie's story that sets it apart from most public ministry situations, because her entire public presence was built on grief. On having lived through the unsurvivable and emerged with something real to offer, which means that any fracture in that picture doesn't just affect her professionally. It carries an emotional weight that reaches into the moments where the people who trusted her were most exposed. When someone builds a platform on personal pain, on saying honestly, I have been through this. And here is what I found on the other side, the people who receive that don't simply consume it as information. They invest in it, they extend something delicate to the person at the center. They say, without always forming the words consciously, I believe you, I trust what you've been through. I trust what you're giving me because of it. That kind of trust is not abstract or transactional, it is intimate. It lives in specific memories, a paragraph read at 2 in the morning, a sentence underlined with shaking hands. A moment in a retreat room where someone finally let themselves feel something they had been holding back for months. And when something arises that complicates the picture of the person at the center of all those moments, the people who gave that trust don't simply feel let down. They feel something harder to locate, a kind of vertigo, a disturbance in something they didn't even realize they were relying on. Those who work at the intersection of ministry accountability and psychological harm have noted, in broader terms, that trust built on shared vulnerability carries specific and serious responsibilities. According to researchers in this area, when that trust is perceived to be broken, even at a distance, even without direct personal harm, the impact on community members can carry qualities that resemble relational trauma. Not because anything was done to them directly, but because something that felt like a safe relationship turned out to be more complicated than it appeared. None of this settles the specific questions surrounding Nancy Guthrie. No official conclusion has been reached. No definitive account has emerged that resolves the matter clearly. What it offers instead is a frame for understanding why this situation, whatever its full shape eventually turns out to be, carries the weight that it does for the people living inside it. Because grief, real grief, leaves people open in places they cannot always protect. What keeps this story from settling into any easy shape is not simply the absence of clear answers. It is the presence of so much that remains genuinely unresolved, and the reality that unresolved things, for people who have already lived through devastating loss, are not a neutral experience. They are familiar, they are painful in a way that doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. The community that gathered around Nancy Guthrie's voice was not built on entertainment or surface-level inspiration. It was built on something far more serious, the shared, difficult work of living through grief and trying to find solid ground on the other side. The people in that community understand, perhaps more than most, what it means when something you trusted disappears without giving you anything to hold onto in its place. And that is exactly where many of them are sitting now. Questions have been raised. Reports have moved through various channels in various forms. Some people within the relevant ministry and accountability structures appear to still be working through whatever the situation fully involves. But for the audience, the ordinary grieving people who found her books at the worst moments of their own lives, that process is invisible. They are left with pieces. With the quiet disorientation of watching from outside, something they cannot fully see or understand. Nancy Guthrie has not released comprehensive public statements addressing the situation in full. Whether that reflects ongoing process, legal considerations, personal discernment, or counsel from the people around her, the effect for the people waiting is the same. A silence that must somehow be sat with. And silence, for people who have spent years learning to sit with the unanswerable, is not new, but it is never easy. There is also the question of what endures. What happens to the words already written, the retreats already held, the moments of genuine comfort already given? Whether the people who were genuinely helped by those things can hold on to what helped them. Whether they can separate, as much as that is ever possible, what they received from the uncertainty now surrounding the person who offered it. These are not questions with simple answers. For people already navigating grief, they may not be questions with any answers at all. And yet they remain present, unresolved, asking to be held even when holding them is hard. There is something almost unbearably human about a story like this one, not because of what fractured or what is still unknown, but because of everything surrounding it, the years of genuine care given, the real pain honestly shared, the real people who were genuinely helped. And now this unresolved space that nobody quite has the language for yet. It would be easier if these stories moved in straight lines, if the person at the center turned out to be entirely one thing or entirely another. If trust was either fully earned or entirely misplaced, and we could know which one from the outside with certainty. But real life does not cooperate with that kind of clarity. People are almost always more layered than the version of them we come to know through a book, a voice on a podcast, a weekend in a retreat room. Not necessarily because anything was being hidden, but because the version of a person that reaches through a public platform is always partial. Always shaped even when the shaping is completely sincere. Nancy Guthrie gave people something real. Whatever else the current moment holds, that much is genuinely difficult to dispute. The parents who found her words in hospital rooms. The widows who finally discovered language for the silence they had been carrying. The grieving fathers who sat in her sessions and maybe for the first time in months, allowed themselves to feel what they had been holding back. What those people experienced was not nothing. It was not performance, it was not hollow, and yet, the questions that have emerged are also real. They deserve to be held carefully, not out of any desire to watch someone fall, and not to dismiss what was genuinely offered, but because the people at the center of situations like this one, including those who brought concerns forward, are not abstractions. They are people, their experiences matter. Their voices deserve space too. What comes next for Nancy Guthrie remains genuinely unknown. Whether she steps back into public ministry in some form or steps away entirely, or whether resolution of any kind reaches the people still waiting for it, none of that is certain. No official conclusion has been reached, and perhaps that honesty is the most solid ground available right now. We are in the middle of something, not at its beginning, not at its end. Just in the middle, which is, in its own strange way, exactly where grief has always lived. The unanswered questions are not a failure of this story. In many ways, they are the story. And for the people who found something in her words that helped them survive what they never thought they could survive, the quiet invitation now may simply be to hold what was genuinely good. Ask honest questions without demanding premature answers, and resist the pressure to arrive somewhere conclusive before the full picture has had the time and space it needs to emerge. That is a hard thing to do, but it is a profoundly human thing, and sometimes that is the only place left to stand. If something in this story stayed with you, if it raised a question you're still sitting with, or touched something you weren't expecting, the comments are open. You don't have to have an answer. You just have to be willing to be honest about what you're feeling. That matters here. If this kind of careful, human storytelling is something you want more of, subscribing means you'll be here when the story continues to unfold. We'll keep paying attention. And we'll keep trying to get it right.